We do have a testifier from the U of M.
Very well, thank you, Representative Kwan. Welcome to the committee, Ms. Dr. Spanis. Martin, we had a meeting a few days ago, and you enlightened me to a vast world of emerging knowledge in this regard, so I look forward to your testimony today.
My name is Donna Spanis-Martin, and I'm a professor of medical laboratory science at the University of Minnesota, although I am not here representing the views and policies of the University of Minnesota. They make me say that. I have a PhD in biochemistry. I'm a certified medical laboratory scientist. I teach clinical chemistry and body fluid analysis, including drug analysis. Chairman Mariani, I appreciate the opportunity to speak before this committee. As the state of Minnesota considers the legalization of marijuana for recreational use, I want adequate consideration to be given as to how the state will define driving while impaired. Measuring delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, the primary psychoactive component of cannabis, is not like measuring a blood alcohol concentration. Ethanol is water-soluble and volatile, so it can be easily measured in the breath and in the blood. There is a clear national standard as to when your blood alcohol concentration is too high for you to be driving, 0.08%. Setting a marijuana-related impairment level is much more complicated. THC is fat-soluble and is rapidly removed from the blood. It can decrease by as much as 90% within 90 minutes. It is then slowly released from fatty tissues, so lower concentrations can be found in the blood for weeks. This also presents a problem because there is not a linear relationship between blood THC concentration and the degree of impairment. With a 5 nanogram per milliliter THC blood concentration, which is the level that they've set in Colorado and I believe a few other states, a first-time user would show definite signs of impairment, while someone who used marijuana 5 times a week would not likely be impaired with this blood THC concentration. A study conducted in Norway compared blood THC concentration of drivers suspected of driving under the influence of cannabis to the status of their impairment, the amount that they were impaired, which was evaluated by a physician. Drivers were classified as either impaired or not impaired. The impaired drivers had a higher mean THC concentration of 2.5 nanograms per milliliter, which is about half of what the Colorado limit was. So that was the average compared to the drivers who were assessed as not impaired, and their mean concentration was 1.9 nanograms per milliliter. However, the blood THC concentration of the non-impaired drivers ranged from 0.32 to 24.8 nanograms per milliliter, which is 5 times what the Colorado limit is, and they're still considered to be not impaired. States have put forth a wide range of definitions as to what they consider to be driving under the influence of cannabis. Colorado has defined intoxication as a driver whose blood THC concentration tests higher than 5 nanograms per milliliter. Looking at the Norwegian study I just mentioned, that means a number of regular users who were not impaired would have been classified as driving under the influence, and there would also have been a number of drivers who were impaired that would not have been classified as driving under the influence. Another study in Sweden stated if you leave that intoxication level at 5 nanograms per milliliter, you miss 90% of the intoxicated drivers. Other states have defined impairment as 1, 2, or 3 nanograms per milliliter, and some have said the presence of any amount of THC in the blood is impaired driving. Some states have specially trained police officers, and they determine if the person is impaired. So it's entirely up to the officer who stops the driver. This has also raised concerns because this can be subjective and is subject to racial bias. Someone who has previously had poor experience with the police may perform worse on field sobriety tests due to nervousness rather than being impaired. Some states are using saliva tests, which have some advantages but also have limitations. No published research has demonstrated a significant association between saliva and whole blood concentrations, and differences in saliva concentrations for smoking, vaporizing, and ingesting marijuana need to be studied further to establish quantitative and qualitative differences. Because dry mouth is a common side effect of cannabis use, insufficient saliva volume can also be a problem for testing. Another issue with driving under the influence of cannabis is that the impairment from cannabis is very different from that seen with ethanol intoxication. So the sobriety tests will need to be different. A field sobriety test for ethanol might involve following a pen with your eyes while the officer moves it back and forth, walking 9 steps heel to toe, and standing on one leg for 30 seconds. This test will identify 88% of alcohol-impaired drivers, but only 30% of marijuana-impaired drivers. Alcohol increases the willingness of a driver to take risks, so they tend to drive faster and overestimate their skills, and the opposite seems to be true for drivers who are high on marijuana. They can pass memory, addition, and subtraction tests, but when confronted with doing multiple tasks or something unexpected, they have difficulty. One article I read stated, "It's typical to see a young adolescent with 3 or 4 other kids in the car," she said of Stone driving. "He's aware he might be impaired, so he's driving carefully. But then he sees an old man in the middle of the street. All of his senses say, 'This guy is there, but will be out of the way by the time I get there.' But then the old man drops his keys, and he's slower than the kid expected. By the time it takes to process a change in the situation, there's an accident." Another article stated that drivers under the influence of alcohol are 20 times more likely to be in an automobile accident than non-impaired drivers, while drivers under the influence of marijuana are only twice as likely to be in an accident. However, the combination of alcohol and marijuana increases the risk even greater than the 20-fold increase. So the use of a combination of drugs while driving may be another issue that needs to be addressed. In conclusion, as Minnesota considers the legalization of marijuana, I would like them also to consider the legal issues that need to be addressed for driving under the influence of marijuana. It is not as simple and straightforward as it is with ethanol and needs to be examined as we move forward. Thank you.
Very well, thank you, Dr. Spanis-Martin. Are there any questions for the testifier? Representative Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the testifier. This Sunday, I saw Senator Jensen on Channel 4 News, and he talked about some states are looking at a combination between the cheek swab as well as the field sobriety tests. Have you found any states that are using a combination of different tests to determine the impairment versus just one or another?
Dr. Spanis-Martin.
I think there's a wide range of states that are using various levels, various testing. Yes, there are some states that are using a combination of things. There's a company in California that says they've now come out with a breathalyzer test. It hasn't been field tested yet, but it will test for both THC and alcohol in the same breath test. So there are companies that are working on developing better tests, and I think right now the best method is having some sort of combination. So I would agree you need more than just a THC level in the person, and probably also more than just a police officer's evaluation.
Very well. I believe Judge Small is here, and sir, I'm wondering if you can come forward for the County Attorneys Association, because I'm curious about what's currently happening in terms of stops and prosecutions other than possession relative to this issue of impaired driving. And it could well be there's nothing, but just if you can fill us in a little bit, sir, in terms of how law enforcement is currently approaching this issue when you have a driver that is high on marijuana.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, my name is Robert Small, and I am the Executive Director of the Minnesota County Attorneys Association, and I sure would like to call a friend on this one. He would probably be just as angry with me. No, he's right there. So, this Sheriff Leslie from Dakota County, who's actually out there and does this.
Very well, thank you, Judge Small.
Mr.
Good
Chair,
afternoon.
members,
Good
yeah,
afternoon,
to say
Sheriff.
that I'm out there is a little bit too much. I'm kind of I ride a desk, so, but I do see the reports that do come across. And so when we have someone who's clearly impaired,
Yeah.
yet shows no signs of alcohol intoxication, then we invoke implied consent and ask them to take a blood test. And right now, any measure of THC in the blood is prima facie of impairment. So that's an automatic, there is no level. If it comes back from the lab that there's THC in the blood, that's deemed enough of a level of presence to deem them guilty of driving while intoxicated.
Very well. I just learned something, and I think we all did. So, and I'm sorry, I need to get your name officially on the record.
But,
If you could
Mr.
just
Chair,
state your name.
Tim Leslie, Dakota County Sheriff.
Thank you, sir. So I'm wondering, Judge Small, then, so I'm hearing that any level of THC then triggers a understanding of driving under impaired. Is that, if that's the case, then what can you tell us in terms of what prosecutors do with that? Do they prosecute that? Do they look for different standards, of the concentration of THC?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, it would be my best judgment that it would be the driving behavior that would be linked to the explanation of whatever is causing that driving behavior. So the prosecutor would look at what the driving behavior was, and then with that additional information of the presence of a substance, a controlled substance, that would be the proof.
Judge Small, that makes sense to me, particularly in light of Dr. Spanis Martin's testimony earlier about our long history and knowledge of alcohol, and being able to confidently set, a level of concentration with confidence that that's producing impaired driving. And so this just really begs the whole question of Representative Quam's, effort here is, can we get to that point relative to THC? We do have some questions, so perhaps if you can remain there, it'd be great, Representative Johnson.
Question is for the sheriff.
Oh,
Question is for the sheriff.
oh, for the sheriff, please, sir.
Chair Mariana, Sheriff, I'm probably one of the few individuals sitting on this table who's actually charged somebody with prescription DWI. And I believe it's 2 convictions I've got for it. It's very difficult to do. But my question deals with more on the THC levels. I've also had done those driving while impaired. But the test results I got from BCA back, they didn't, of course, I've been retired for a little over 6 years now. But the test results never came back with a level. They just said positive or negative for THC. Is that, if that's still the same process?
Sheriff.
Mr. Chair, Representative Johnson, yes, that's correct. It's the presence of that tested substance, whatever the police officer asks to be tested for, cocaine, methamphetamine, they test for them all. And so it'll show on the report which one was present.
Representative Johnson.
That, Chair Mariani, members, that's what I was getting at, is for those chemicals, other than alcohol, they don't give a percentage and what the level is. It's just if it's present. It could be super high for THC. It could be real low. Right now, they're illegal, and so if you have that in your system. Now, for prescription drugs, that's another story because it's very difficult to do. You have to know what the prescription is. They have to calculate what the level is normally if they're inside their prescription. And the ones that I've been able to get convictions on have been able to prove in court that they were 4, 5, 6 times above the level of what their prescription would do. Plus, on a prescription, you have to know what the prescription is to have them physically test for that drug.
Thank you, Representative Johnson. Thank you, Judge Small and Sheriff Leslie, for allowing me to drag you up here to field a question that is a little bit difficult, but it's part of our ongoing learning and discovery process here. Johnson, I think that's parallels what you were sharing earlier, with prescription drugs in particular.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, exactly. It's, we have to look at what the prescription level is on that, what the level would be under that prescription. If they're way over it, then it's an issue. But I do have a clarification on that previous testifier.
Please, sir.
Back when Colorado was still just medical marijuana, there was a very comprehensive study on that, and it showed the use of, just on the medical side, the number of traffic accidents and the number of traffic-related deaths had spiked dramatically.
We may want to get a hold of that study. Dr. Spanis Martin.
One of the things that's mentioned in some of the articles, the reason that you don't see as much of an increase with marijuana as you do with alcohol, and I mentioned alcohol is at 20 times the risk of being in an accident if you're driving while under the influence, and at 2 times the risk if you're under the influence of marijuana. But one article said that alcohol abusers or alcohol users tend to be doing that outside at a bar, so they have to drive home. Marijuana users tend to do it at home, and I think a lot of people are taking their medications at home, so they're not as much on the road also. But there is an increase with both.